Welcome everyone to the REAIM breakout session on bridging the gap between principles and practice in the implementation of military AI. I'd like to thank the Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict at the University of Oxford's Blavatnik School of Government and the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs for serving as co-organizers of this session. From the backroom to the battlefield, AI is now being integrated into the full spectrum of military operations, including in logistics, targeting, decision-making, and weapon systems with increasing levels of autonomy. To navigate this moment responsibly and at responsible speed, policymakers are racing to develop shared understandings and frameworks concerning AI governance. But international consensus, where it exists, tend to be at the level of general principles that are open to interpretation. And as we have seen in other contexts, the most harm often occurs when principles are translated into concrete action. Bearing that in mind, what are the challenges in moving from principles to practice at the tactical, operational, and strategic levels? How can policy, legal, and institutional mechanisms be leveraged to instantiate and operationalize principles for AI governance, such as those contained in the political declaration? To reflect critically on these questions and the path ahead, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce to you our distinguished interdisciplinary group of experts. Professor Tony Erskine, Professor of International Politics in the Department of International Relations at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University, and Associate Fellow of the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence at the University of Cambridge. Dr. Paul Lyons, Senior Director for Defense at the Special Competitive Studies Project, a U.S. Navy captain with 3 decades of naval service, including assignments in the Indo-Pacific, who has also served in a number of strategy and policy positions in the U.S. Department of Defense. To my right, Professor Kenneth Payne, Professor of Strategy at King's College London and a GC REAIM Commissioner, author of I, Warbot, The Dawn of Artificial Intelligence Conflict, among several other books on strategy and the evolution of warfare. And last, Dr. Tess Bridgman, co-editor-in-chief at Just Security, senior fellow and visiting scholar at the Reese Center of Law and Security at the NYU School of Law, and former U.S. National Security Council deputy legal advisor and White House associate counsel. Thank you all for being with us today. A few points of housekeeping before we proceed. This session is designed to be highly interactive, facilitating dialogue amongst the panelists and with audience members. As such, I'll pose a series of questions to panelists who will take roughly 5 minutes to respond to each before opening the floor to broader participation. When asking a question, please do state your name and affiliation, and note that this session is being recorded and will be uploaded to REAIM's YouTube channel. Now, Tony, if I can start with you to kick us off. You've written extensively on responsibility and military AI. Could you briefly describe for us the major trends and challenges that you see with regulating this technology, particularly as states move from principles to practice?
Thanks very much for your question, Brianna. And it's a privilege to be here today. I'll briefly highlight, if I may, 3 challenges associated with regulating military AI. First, and most straightforwardly, we witness a lack of political will when it comes to states regulating military applications of AI. Perhaps understandable hesitation to preemptively prohibit applications whose potential risks and benefits may be contested or simply untested. States may see adopting regulations as putting themselves at a disadvantage in the increasingly high-speed context of war and what has aptly been called the latest global arms race if their adversaries do not impose comparable limits on the development and use of AI-enabled systems. I think this is a challenge that we're all well aware of. Yet even if we do achieve agreement to some degree among some states on some regulations, and even if there's a genuine will to act on them, we still have challenges as we move from principles to practice. And here I want to mention 2 additional challenges that I think have been neglected because our focus has been too narrow in terms of where we identify risks associated with military AI and what we're seeking to regulate. A second challenge is that our focus has been on the conduct of war. on the emerging reality of lethal autonomous weapon systems, as well as on decision support systems in the form of algorithms used for targeting, for example. However, we need to look at AI-enabled systems not only on the battlefield, but also in the war room. The use of machine learning algorithms to advise governments in resort to force decisions is unlikely to be far away. And they are already influencing such decisions indirectly and at different levels through intelligence collection and analysis, for example. And this prospect in emerging reality is one that I'm exploring as part of a collaborative project funded by the Australian Government Department of Defence. Now, I argue that if we seek to ensure adherence to widely accepted norms of restraint in war through regulation, then our focus in addressing AI-enabled military tools needs to extend from the conduct of war to also include state-level decision-making on the very initiation of war and military interventions. From jus ad bello to jus ad bellum considerations in the language of the just war tradition, and from the realm of actions adjudicated by international humanitarian law to the realm of actions constrained and condoned by the UN Charter Prohibition on the Resort to Force and its explicit exceptions. Finally, a third challenge is that moving from principles to practice can be hampered when our use of AI-enabled military systems affects how states, soldiers, and political and military leaders deliberate, how they act, and how they view themselves as responsible agents. We need to remember that significant challenges in the military domain introduced by AI-enabled tools need not be tied to the prospect of their increasing autonomy. Rather, there are insidious, often neglected risks associated with existing non-autonomous AI-enabled systems, and these deserve our attention. Importantly, our interactions with decision support systems, for example, can produce the misperception that they displace us as responsible actors, thereby seeming to let us off the moral hook when it comes to adhering to international norms of restraint in war, I suggest. Automation bias, algorithmic capacity, and our tendency to wildly and often wishfully misattribute characteristics to AI-enabled systems all contribute to such misplaced responsibility. This misplaced responsibility contributes in turn to a gap between principles and practice. Even when we passionately defend international norms of restraint in war, if key actors see themselves as somehow removed from crucial decisions, which nevertheless remain their own, then nobody will perceive themselves to be answerable for upholding these norms in particular contexts. In response, steps to avoid this abrogation of responsibility might involve a greater focus on regulation in terms of how AI-enabled tools in the military domain are designed to interact with human operators and decision makers. And there are many more challenges that I could go through, but I think I'll leave it at those three.
Thank you so much, Tony. Ken, I wonder if I can bring you in here because you've spoken quite a bit about how we need to be focused more on the AI of tomorrow and not just the AI of today. I wonder what challenges and risks do you see, particularly at the strategic level, as states try to move into this implementation phase?
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming to the jet lag slot. I think there's a few of us in the room that are fighting through, and I'm certainly one of them. I've had more caffeine than one should probably have in an afternoon, so bear with me. Look, I think the biggest threats, challenge, dangers from AI in the military domain aren't perhaps what we spend a lot of time here and in forums like this focusing on. Here we hear a lot about killer robots, tactical use of AI in autonomous platforms, and the challenges that poses or doesn't pose for international humanitarian law, and perhaps the need for governance or regulation of these things. This is an important topic, but it captures a lot of airtime in these forums at the expense of what I think is actually a more important challenge, risk, and danger, which is at the strategic level, as Brianna alluded to, which is the impact of these systems on decision-making and thinking about war, and the potential for miscalculation that ensues as a result of that. In Clausewitzian terms, Clausewitz had this slightly puzzling, opaque phrase, talking about the grammar of war. Well, I think we more or less understand the grammar of war as it is now, and it's a contest, it's adversarial, but we're trying to think about other human decision makers opposite us. We may not do the job perfectly, but at least we've got a hazy idea of what we're dealing with. And we're moving into a world where there's less certainty about what these systems are, what they do, how they interact with human decision makers, what levels of force they're able to control, and with what degree of automaticity. And that uncertainty and rapid change is, for me, the greatest puzzle here. And I'd like to see more time spent in forums like this thinking about that challenge and rather less thinking about killer robots and international humanitarian law. And for why? We know that at times of uncertainty and potentially rapid shifts in global power, because after all, not every state is going to be as good at instrumentalizing these technologies as other states, so there's the potential for power shifts to happen fairly rapidly, and we know historically that this is destabilizing and often correlates pretty well with conflict. So I think there's reason to be cautious about AI in the military domain at that strategic level, not the tactical level. And I think actually we heard from the Dutch Defence Minister early this morning mention of strategic stability, and I think we'll actually hear some more about that, hopefully, in the statement that comes out at the end of this conference. But then it's time to start, I think, actually putting the flesh on those bones. And that is a question for everybody, of course. There's no gatekeeping here. But it's a question that brings into play people that are particularly focused on thinking about strategic studies, as opposed to hitherto, where the debate has been dominated by people who are thinking about international law. And that's the change that I'd like to see.
Thank you so much, Ken. Sticking on the strategic level for a moment, Paul, I wonder if you can walk us through a little bit how we should think about AI governance in the increasingly fragmented international order, where the rules-based international order is under increasing strain, and we have geopolitical conflict and a number of both adversaries and allies who have not endorsed initiatives such as the political declaration, including Israel, Russia, and China. How should we think about AI governance in this context, particularly as AI technologies are already being deployed on the battlefield in places like Gaza and Ukraine?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And first of all, thank you for inviting me to the panel. And I'd like to also publicly thank the Republic of Korea, MOFA, and M&D for the great work behind the scenes to put on REAIM. It's a great question, and one that I think is, from the SCSP perspective, it's really a question of deliberateness. And I would offer there's three venues that might be applicable to states that are approaching this problem at the geostrategic level. One is, do you govern up front? Do you provide the governance? Do you provide the bureaucracy? Steady as she goes, if I can put it in naval terms. Then there's the innovate at speed, where you experiment rapidly in a controlled setting that then allows to figure out what governance model works. And then there's this notion in the middle of responsible speed. And somewhere between responsible speed and the experiment as we go is speaking for SCSP and the US perspective, is where we believe that democratically aligned states that share common values, that have a universal vision of what global order should do. I think values are already intrinsic in what we're going to do with AI. The second side of this answer is, I'll put on my Navy captain hat, the operator hat, is I wouldn't want anybody else prescribing how a weapon system, a tool, a decision aid should be used in the military domain than the operator themselves. We are indoctrinated on values and ethics and morality. I mean, that's in our DNA. And so I think that's part of the equation, that is, as we approach what is responsible AI, how should that be implemented? The foot stomp here is it starts with the operators to make sure that the end product is responsible, because otherwise, I think to your second part of your question, is irresponsible use of AI leads to an escalation ladder that cannot be controlled, right? And that's something that as for the signatory states, that's what we want, right? We want human in the loop. We want responsible AI use, which then leads to a two-party system, if you will, of everybody on the same page in terms of escalation dynamics. When you have non-signatories, and I think the declaration puts people on notice, non-signatories on notice, that is the inherent risk, that it's not a fair game, and irresponsible escalation dynamics could occur as a result of some type of conflict where AI is not governed to, again, human in the loop, to autonomous systems without some type of controlling mechanism up front. And the last point I'll add is let's make eye contact with the challenge that there's a innovation contest ongoing at the strategic level, right? And as I said in the last panel, for those that might have attended it, do you want a world with responsible AI, with whatever speed we choose, or do you want an autocratic prescription which sets, if they're the first mover, sets in place norms, values, use cases, and is that the world you want? So while governance is important, while responsible speed is important, let's not forget that there's an innovation race, and the first mover will assign those values. And I'm going to vote for the second case. Thank you.
It's really helpful. Thank you. I want to ask a quick follow-up question based on something you said, and it's a bit controversial, but bear with me. To what extent do you think the normative framing or even the responsible AI framing might actually be an impediment to building a more truly global consensus with competitors, with adversaries, versus an approach that's based rooted more firmly in mutual interest and strategic stability and global prosperity? Do we need to adjust the framing or the language around how we talk about the global governance of AI to build that truly multilateral coalition?
Great question. I love the controversial nature of it. Thanks for giving me that. But no, I mean, I think, and I've said this in previous panels today, is we in the democratic states have been operating for decades with shared value, universal vision, and that is built on a core of trust, right? And that's built over time. That's irreplaceable. And I think the governance in place is good enough. I don't think it needs to be adjusted because the underlying issue is there's inherent trust in the system. So I think we are in the right place for this. I think that we shouldn't lose focus on the fact that trust is inherent in who we are and what we do and the visions we follow and the values that serve us as we prescribe how AI should be used. Yeah, thank you.
Tess, I want to bring you into this discussion a little bit to talk more about what, in your view, democratically aligned states should do to prepare for a world which is already here, where there are competing views on AI adoption. So where authoritarian regimes are exporting their own views on AI governance, where even within ally blocs such as NATO and others, allies may have different views, and there's leading to regulatory fragmentation and problems with interoperability. What should democratic states do given varying levels of capacity, varying levels of political views, of political will, and different views about how this technology should be developed and deployed?
Sure, thanks, Brianna. It's an important question, and I do think the innovation contest that Paul referenced, it's a technical one. It's one that has financial and resource components, of course, but it's also a normative one. And I would start, though, by saying that democratically aligned states should still seek consensus where it is possible across the democratic authoritarian divide. I wouldn't write off the possibility that there are some points of convergence. I think you're most likely to see those at a high level of generality, and we've all talked about why we need to get more specific. We'll continue to talk about that. But you might see some very particular areas where there is, in fact, room for convergence, possibly in the nuclear domain, possibly others. So I think it's worth still thinking through where that broader consensus is possible, but where it is not, right, where differences exist, and differences will continue to exist because what states are willing to commit to, of course, depends on their domestic and their geopolitical goals, which, as we know, are quite divergent at present, is where we need to see states at the national level, but also in regional configurations, in coalitions, whatever groupings are possible, really start to get much more specific in clarifying what responsible AI means across very specific use cases at a really granular level. And the question is, against what benchmarks will we assess whether we're meeting our own political commitments over the lifetime of the AI systems for the use cases for which they were developed. And I think in getting more specific in that standard setting function and doing so as transparently as possible, it's important that we don't fall into the trap of assuming that any regulation or constraint is necessarily efficiency reducing, right? So the framing that I think is really important to keep in mind is that implementing RAI principles can create efficiency, effectiveness, and legitimacy. How is that? It's an enabler of trust in the AI systems that we're producing and operating. And trust, in turn, can foster faster adoption of those capabilities. So I think, that the DoD RAI strategy and implementation pathway is one example of an attempt to do just that. There are others underway in other countries, other coalitions and groupings will, I'm sure, not be too far behind. But the sooner democratically aligned states can coalesce around what those specifics look like, the thicker and stickier those understandings will be, the more legitimacy they will have, and the more trustworthy the AI systems that come out of these states will be. And that matters in a world, right, where some states will be the sellers and others will be the buyers of AI systems. The trustworthiness of the product, the legitimacy of the product will really matter. So I guess as a takeaway, I'd say it's important for democratically aligned states to remember that you can balance innovation with dynamic regulation. The two are not mutually exclusive, and in fact, one can further the other.
That's great. Just a quick follow-up there. So we've been talking about democratic versus authoritarian states, but it strikes me that even within democratically aligned blocks of states, there are very divergent views. To take one example, Israel has been quite controversial in the news about its use of AI decision support systems in Gaza. They haven't endorsed the political declaration. So what should states do, leading AI powers do, when even allies don't endorse these key principles, particularly given the fact that there's so much opacity around what the actual procedures are that states are following at a domestic level? Are there levers, policy, legal, or other institutional levers that states can turn to try to get allies to also adhere and implement the same types of norms? And are there any concerns about joint operations and potential liability issues that arise from that?
Sure. I think the first step is what I had alluded to previously, which is where there are diverging views, states need to take responsibility for stating what their own view is with as much specificity as possible, as transparently as possible, which is sometimes hard to do in some of the use cases you're describing, in fact. But that initial step of being as transparent as possible at a more granular level, I think, can induce others to do the same. Transparency has a pull factor, and especially among states who want their operations to be viewed as legitimate, as lawful. There is an additional pull when your states with which you act in coalition, your partners, your allies, are engaging in that kind of explanation and that kind of public and specific reason-giving, which has normative and legal value and operational value as well. So I think that is the first step. Beyond that, I think it's going to take a while for us to see where states coalesce when the rubber meets the road beyond what is legally required. So I think there's already a baseline here, right, of are you meeting your IHL obligations, your jus ad bellum obligations, your international human rights law obligations to the extent those are applicable, et cetera. Beyond that, when we're looking above the threshold of what the law requires, I think we're not yet at the point where we'll see partners, criticizing each other about those kinds of use cases. Below the threshold of legality, I think, is where that's already fair game.
Ken, I want to turn to you for a second. You've spoken a bit about responsible AI not being synonymous with regulation. I wonder if you can expand on that point a little bit more, that perhaps in some cases the most responsible course of action might actually be unfettered use of AI if adversaries are taking that approach. And how should we think about the responsible AI discourse in the context of this geopolitical context that we've been discussing?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'd sign up to that description of what I've said. I think my point was to say that it's irresponsible to limit the discussion of responsibility to killer robots, international humanitarian law, and it's irresponsible to think of see the issue fundamentally as about governance, regulation, arms control, banning. It's more responsible to me to see the issue in the round and to listen very carefully to what Paul said, which is the authentic voice of the forces at work here. This is a competition. There is a danger of first mover advantage. We are talking about two or more ideologically opposed ways of constructing a society. We can't talk our way out of that dynamic, and we can't regulate our way out of that dynamic, and you can bet your backside that's the way the issue is perceived in Beijing as well as it is in Washington. It's a raging cliche, I know, but whenever I have the discussion on AI in Europe, it's about regulation, governance, arms control. It's not the tenor of the discussion where you go elsewhere, and I think it would be naive to try and imagine that it were otherwise. So that's how I'd caveat that. On Israel not signing up, it's interesting that they could very easily sign up to that declaration. The declaration is constructed as to be broad, and I wrote banal enough that anybody could sign up. And that's the point of diplomacy, and I'm forever happy that I'm not making my career as a diplomat, is to sit year on year and listen to the same broad and non-committal, banal things. I did actually have a discussion with a diplomat from one country who shall remain unnamed at another one of these gatherings, and I was asking how the sausage got made. Who decides what gets written in the thing? And this person said, "Well, it's me." And I said, "Well, that seems a lot of power, fairly young person." So that seems a lot of power. He said, "I can put whatever I like in it as long as it's entirely non-committal." And, that's for the practitioners in the room, that's how the sausage gets made. And so there's no reason that Israel would have for not signing up to this, except that they don't want to frame the issue, perhaps, in that way of governance, regulation, and so on. So I think that's the insight I would have there. We would all wish that we weren't in an arms race, but the fact is that for various reasons we are. And then the other thing I would say that characterizes the debate now is it's very focused on where AI is now and not necessarily on where AI is going to next. And this is a failure of imagination on all our parts. It's hard to think about what hasn't actually arrived yet without sounding too much like a crazy sci-fi enthusiast. But we would do well, I think, to lift our eyes a little bit from the sorts of capabilities we're talking about now, even if that's something as cutting edge, and if that's the right way of saying it, as lavender. There's plenty more different things that are coming down the track that we need to be thinking about.
That's really helpful. Thank you, Ken, and thanks for that clarification. Tony, I wonder if you could give us your perspective on the prospects for forging international cooperation surrounding AI development and use, and also thinking about the implementation phase as we move from the norms to implementation. What needs to be done in terms of capacity building and concrete steps at the global level, not just amongst allies, but also with competitors?
Yeah, thank you, Brianna. I think fostering international norms, which has been coming up, is necessarily a slow and arduous process, regardless of the context. And just to say what I mean by international norms, I mean widely acknowledged, internalized principles that embody established codes of what actors should do or refrain from doing in relation to particular practices. And of course, international norms on the use and the resort to force are already established, not always adhered to, but they're already established, and they're codified in international humanitarian law and the UN Charter when we talk about the resort to force. And there are compelling arguments made that we can work within these existing legal and ethical frameworks in seeking to regulate the development and use of AI-enabled systems in the military domain. And on one hand, I think that these arguments are correct. We can and we must work within these existing, incredibly hard-won frameworks. On the other hand, I don't think that these frameworks are sufficient when it comes to ensuring that the norms of restraint that they embody are adhered to once we introduced AI-enabled systems. So not only are particular principles open to debate and different interpretations when we turn to their application to AI-enabled systems, but to address some of the challenges that I mentioned earlier, we also need to foster new norms that embody what we might call supplementary responsibilities of restraint. Simply by supplementary responsibilities of restraint, I mean responsibilities to create the conditions within which we can discharge the duties of restraint that are already endorsed in international relations. And such supplementary responsibilities would go beyond our current institutionalized norms and be borne by the range of actors that contribute to creating, deploying, and using AI-enabled systems in the military domain, including designers and developers of AI-enabled military tools. So we might think of examples of international norms surrounding the design of AI-enabled military tools, such as imperatives to curb our tendency to anthropomorphize them, perhaps incorporating cues into such tools that reinforce human agency and responsibility, something that I'm interested in, and requirements to make the decision-making of machine intelligence, along with its limitations, more transparent, as recommended in the 2023 political declaration. In other words, we face the dual task of establishing a consensus on new applications of existing hard-won international norms, and also generating agreement on new principles that would contribute to emerging norms. So how do we go about fostering such norms in the absence of formal agreements and anything resembling a universal consensus? As the very beginning of an answer, I'd like to offer a provocation and go back to a term that has come up a number of times, the coalition. We often talk about coalitions of the willing convening in the context of particular international crises. Coalitions of the willing are self-selected constellations of states and sometimes non-state and intergovernmental actors that come together to respond to a specific crisis, often in the absence of a formal overarching intergovernmental body willing or able to act effectively. So we need a coalition of the willing when it comes to fostering new international norms for the military use of AI and adapting existing norms to changing contexts in order to ensure that our already espoused commitments to restraint in war are not eroded. And maybe the summit is a nascent version of such a coalition. Yet I would offer one qualification to this recommendation. Given our high-stakes context and the fact that we, citizens, scholars, political and military leaders, states, corporations, are the ones responsible for ensuring that restraint is exercised when AI-enabled technologies are introduced to the military domain, it would make more sense to call this body a coalition of the obligated.
Tess, Tony alluded this a bit in her remarks. So we've been talking a little bit on the margins about law, but I wonder if we can shift from the normative to the legal focus, and you could walk us through, in your view, what role law has to play in bridging the gap between principles and practice, and relatedly, what are the prospects for legal regulation in this space?
Yeah, so I'd start with, I think, something that we've all been acknowledging, which is that there already is a good deal of legal regulation in this space, right? So we hear, and I think it's still a relatively commonly expressed concern that these powerful new technologies are somehow ungoverned or even ungovernable, when of course in reality it is not a Wild West. There is nothing about the use of a new technology that changes the nature of our legal obligations. In war, in peace, domestically, internationally, full stop, right? International law in particular, right, is technology neutral. I think a way of saying this that I've heard that's specific to AI that I find appealing is You can't ask an algorithm to do a thing that humans would not be permitted to do. And I think, the tricky question is, with respect to some of the most difficult use cases, exactly how international law applies is something that we still need to do more mapping of. And I think of that as something similar to what the international community has been doing for the last decade and a half or so with respect to cyberspace, coming up with the Talon Manual, the work of the GGE, et cetera. These were multi-year processes, some of which are still ongoing. There are still some fissures in the international community on some of these issues, but it was work that was worth doing. States have come out with their own positions that have elucidated what customary international law means in these specific situations. A very similar process needs to happen with respect to specific AI use cases. Of course, understanding that what law applies is different depending on what tool you're actually talking about and how it's being used. So that would be the first point. I think the easy part is acknowledging that yes, we still have obligations. Humans still hold them and states still hold them. I think the harder part is, in fact, just understanding how the technology works, making sure that we understand it and that it is understandable. I think explainability can be a real issue in some use cases. And we're at the point where, as the technology advances, we do have to be careful what we ask it to do in use cases where reasonableness is going to be a touchstone of legality, where explainability is really going to matter. So I'd say, with that as the throat clearing, actually, there are three main things that I would focus on in terms of where international law and those of us who think in terms of law will be headed. One is we do need to start with getting that basic agreement among states about how international law applies to specific use cases. We need to see processes in place that will enable states to not only take positions, but understand where there's divergence and where those need to be fleshed out further. Second, we of course need to layer on non-binding instruments that are already being developed. And we have many examples under discussion at this very summit. And I think it's important here to just note that there is a long history in the military domain of translating legal and ethical principles into practice through non-binding instruments. ROE, rules of engagement, right, military manuals, doctrine, codes of conduct. This is not a new concept. It is just something that needs to be done in this new domain as the technology emerges and as we get comfortable with how we're applying it. And that, in turn, right, can help build broader consensus over time and even, dare I say it, aid in the progressive development of the law, should it be necessary in the future. I don't think we're there yet, to be clear, but that is something that, without the work of states taking these kinds of positions, without these non-binding instruments becoming more specific, we won't ever get there. So I think that's the intermediate step. And finally, the third thing would be the role of institutions. There are many institutions that are already involved in standard setting, in knowledge sharing, in capacity building in various ways. I think there's a real question of where will the center of gravity be, and which institutions do we need to invest in as an international community to ensure that it's not just about how individual states and how the private sector within individual states responsibly develop AI. It's also about the sharing and dissemination of those tools once they're developed. And that is where I think there will be a role for institutions at the global or regional level to have a role in that, from the technical side as well as from the knowledge sharing and capacity building side.
That's really helpful. I want to bring Paul into this conversation exactly now and just ask, in addition to what you're going to add, speaking of rules of engagement and code of conduct, it strikes me that perhaps in some cases, or even in many cases, implementation may need to be more of a bottom-up process than a top-down process. So I'm interested in your views, and Paul, in your views as well, about to what extent do you see that implementation happening more organically from the bottom up and as an iterative process with feedback loops, given the rapidly changing nature of the technology and the fact that it hasn't been deployed in all of these use cases yet?
maybe I'll take this first, but I love your argument about non-binding agreements and the fact that to beta test the legal frameworks, and to answer your question, is we need to experiment, right? And all of us, all of our nations represented on the stage here, have a storied history and an exemplar history of working well together, of interoperability, integrated nature, and that comes through decades of laborious work at the tactical level, right? Understanding that we might all speak the same language, but we have a different perspective, right? And I think, to Tessa's point, that we need to get AI out of the esoteric space and into the experimental space, right? Which means controlled experimentation, use it in combined and joint exercises, and derive those lessons learned that will spur governance, non-binding agreements, should there be a new legal architecture, should ROE change, should weapons release authority change. I think the answers to those questions will come out of that beta test at the experimental stage at the tactical level. I just can't stress that enough, because isn't that why we're here? We're here for responsible use at the tactical level, right? Certainly there's a strategic end to this, the geostrategic imperative, but it's all about preparing for conflict and doing so responsibly. And I think you don't wait for conflict to figure that out. The time is to do that now. And where we do have a combined capability, combined interoperability, now is the time to experiment in a combined setting. And we do this in exercises today in growing speed and scale. But I think that's where it resides. Tess, maybe you have some additional points.
I do want to open this up to audience questions very shortly, but just to turn to all of our panelists for one very brief final intervention, could each of you just in one sentence, and I know this is tricky, but in just one sentence, could you offer one concrete step, because we've been talking about the need to be much more concrete in these discussions, one concrete step that government should take today to ensure the responsible use of military AI now and in the future? Tony, I'll start with you.
Sure. I'll try to make this one sentence. I think, to borrow a phrase from Professor Jenny Davis at Vanderbilt University, we need experts in the loop. She argues we don't just need humans in the loop, but experts in the loop. And to have experts in the loop in these AI-enabled military systems, we need training at all levels, and we need ongoing education to make sure that those who are operating, those who are interpreting these systems know what they're doing and understand both the risks and benefits. That was a run-on sentence, Brianna, but it was one, I think.
I'm not going to cheat. Sack a few lawyers, hire a few strategic studies scholars.
Centralized control, decentralized execution.
Those aren't even sentences, but I will try. We'll try to do it in just one. Be as radically transparent as possible in your deployment of military AI, and the legal and policy analysis you've used to ensure its legality and its trustworthiness.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And please join me in thanking all of our panelists for these insightful interventions, and we'll then open up the panel to questions. And please remember to state your name and affiliation as you ask your question. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Simon Cleabury from the Geneva Centre for Security Policy. Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on what was being said about strategic stability, because I think that is one of the big concerns here. But of course, it's happening at a time when those countries that need to be talking to each other about these issues aren't. And the forums that we have for doing that, such as the P5 process or bilateral arms control strategic stability discussions, aren't happening. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about how to misquote you, Ken, how to talk ourselves out of strategic instability at a time when it's so difficult for those countries and the countries that most need to be talking to each other about this, to talk to each other. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that is a pressing challenge, and obviously no easy solution to it. You could propose things like joint tabletop exercises just to work through ideas about how AI works theoretically in escalation dynamics, and these sorts of confidence building exchanges at the level of think tanks and so on are one part of the solution. Others are forums like shouldn't really talk about the competition to REAIM here, but the Austrian government's autonomous weapons conference had representatives from China, the US, I think Russia was there even. So there are still some forums where potential adversaries can meet and talk through these issues. No doubt a big challenge that I don't have easy answers for. One extension to that, though, I would say is there's another interesting dynamic at work here, which is between those countries that are going to do really well at developing these technologies, instrumentalizing them and using them, and those countries that aren't, that are going to have to think about the implications for their fighting power. So if you've got a let's call it a legacy military that relies on hardware rather than software, that employs large sections of your young male population in uniform, you have to think through what the implications are of this transition for that legacy model, and that contributes to potential instability as well. So it's not just the instability between ideological adversaries, it's between those that are going to do really well and those that aren't. And those, dare I say it slightly controversially again, those that are going to do less well out of it, I suspect we'll find at the front of the queue talking about norms, governance, regulation, and the need to keep a lid on these technologies.
Yes, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the sharing. My name is Ayong Moon. I'm a professor at the Seoul Cyber University, Department of Convergence of Defense. And at the same time, I'm doing my dual role as a representative of peace education organization called Peace Momo based here. And listening to the stories today, I'm quite pessimistic about this international regulation for the responsible AI use in military domain, because we do have international law, but it is not respected. And although it is violated, nobody is being punished. So with this limitation, now we are developing another international legal framework for the responsible AI use in military domain. And I think I'm a little bit frightened that we are thinking that the death of people, death of civilians as a collateral damage. And I think that's the basic baseline that we are discussing on. So what can you do with this responsible use of AI in military domain? What does it really mean to be responsible? This is too much fundamental question, but I think we really need to discuss about it. And the way the moderator moderated this session, I really felt I could raise this question in this session. So that's why I'm raising this issue with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. I will briefly attempt maybe one aspect of an answer and would be interested in what others have to say as well. And I think the one cautionary note that I would begin with is that enforcement of international law is a problem that is also technology neutral. So this has been an issue, I would say, for millennia, not just for decades. It is one that has been particularly acute in some recent conflicts that we've seen that have been largely prosecuted without the use of AI-enabled weapon systems. And unfortunately, that means that it is simply not new, and AI in that sense doesn't change the equation. I think where we do see the issue of AI-enabled systems potentially having a bigger effect is where they introduce scale and speed to an already non-compliant system. So I think, the way to perhaps start talking about that is that AI won't fix a non-compliant framework. It may, in fact, exacerbate it. So if you're feeding targets into a framework that simply has a faulty proportionality analysis, having more targets faster can exacerbate that problem. But it was the faulty proportionality analysis that is, in fact, the root cause of the problem. So I would just caution us to think about the frameworks, again, as being technology neutral, and looking at the ways in which perhaps the speed or the scale may be enhanced. But at bottom, what we need to ensure is that the human intent that lies in how those machine-human systems are developed and operated is aligned with the law and with our principles. That is still the foundation, and that needs to be improved upon, whether we're talking about militaries that use AI systems or militaries that use militias and machetes. We still have to deal with that same core set of problems.
I think that raises a really important point, Tess, that I want to underscore, which is that the problem is not the technology itself, but rather the ways in which that technology is used. So AI could be used to speed up the decision-making process. Policymakers could leverage that speed to actually introduce tactical pauses into fighting, to consider alternative options to the use of force, to actually reduce civilian harm. But on the contrary, we can see that the opposite is also true, that it increases the pace of targeting. And when those proportionality calculations, for example, are not finely balanced, where mistakes and biases and hallucinations and other problems are introduced into the system and then compounded through an interagency process, that's where we see the increased civilian harm in that particular context. Also just want to emphasize that not to say that the responsible AI framing is not the framing we should accept, but just to say that what is responsible AI might be contested by different players in the international system, and how do we overcome those differing perceptions of what is responsible and what strategy different states should adopt. Also want to turn to Ken, for example, for a minute, because his view on this.
Yeah, I do, thank you. I just sometimes listen to myself talking in venues like this and feel increasingly like Dr. Strangelove. So this is an opportunity to go in the other direction and say I'm more optimistic than you. For me, perversely, one of the strengths of international law is that more than occasional failure to follow through and prosecute the offenders in the way that you would do in a domestic court, international law's flexibility and its accommodation of the realities of power in international affairs is a delicate ongoing dance. And there are times when international law tries to get too rigid about these things. The League of Nations would be a great example, or the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where everybody sat down and outlawed war. They signed a piece of paper in 1928 saying no more wars. And it's those moments of rigidity that are the weaknesses of international law. The moments of flexibility and the delicate dance of norms and power is what gives international law its strength and vitality for me. So I'm more optimistic than you.
If I can just touch on some of these points. I think we need to acknowledge that the character of warfare is changing as well. To Ken's point of, we need thinking forward on the horizon. The speed and character of warfare is evolving, right? Hypersonics, glide vehicles, space-based systems. So I share Ken's optimism that AI can be, in one viewpoint, an enabler, or it can be a disabler. I would say from the U.S. perspective and from the operational perspective that at the character warfare we have today, the targeting cycle, the oversight, the collateral damage calculations, the proportionality, the level of complexity of human involvement and human decision-making is appropriate, right? And so how do you fast forward to a world where the speed and character warfare changes, decision-making has to change, has to get quicker. So AI can be an enabler. I'm an optimist, and SCSP is a proponent of imbuing that human value, but at an increased speed. And I think that's the world we're heading towards. So there's multiple viewpoints, but I'm an optimist. on this end. Thanks.
I feel I've heard that the character of warfare is changing for at least the past 2 decades, but I think what's critically different here with AI technology compared to conventional military technologies is that they're not only changing the ways in which we use force, but actually changing the ways in which we conceive of force, and that human-machine interaction and that feedback loop is going to be critically important going forward. But I just want to bring Tony in for a second to hear your views on this.
Sure, just to the last question, and I agree with everything that's already been said. And I usually find myself on these issues being at the pessimistic end of the spectrum, so I'm really happy to have the chance to say you should be more optimistic when you said that you felt pessimistic. And I think just in addition to what's already been said, as someone who works on international norms, I want to go back to that point because I think you started by saying the reason that you're pessimistic is nobody adheres to international laws and norms anyway, so it's sort of what's the point? But I think that existing norms are incredibly important, and I also think that the norms that we have do influence actions. Sometimes they're acknowledged in their abrogation. I absolutely acknowledge that. But even when states don't adhere to particular established norms, they're often forced to justify their actions. We can socialize delinquent states into gradually adhering to norms they want to be recognized as legitimate. So I just want to, on that one point, your starting point, say that actually international norms really matter. So what we're trying to do is to establish these new norms and enforce existing norms in this area. It's a worthwhile endeavor.
We have time for maybe one more question and then we'll wrap up.
The jet lag is kicked in.
Well, if there's no more questions, then I'll just draw out one final thought here. So obviously, we're not going to solve all of these complex questions today. This is really just intended to be the start of a wider dialogue on these issues. A couple of themes that have come out today and throughout the REAIM summit thus far is the need to be really more forensic in the types of questions that we're asking, to identify where key knowledge gaps exist, and then to be concrete and use specific case studies to test our hypothesis, to see how the principles and the implementation of those principles play out in practice. These are themes that have emerged in this panel and indeed throughout the REAIM summit. I'd like to invite you all to connect with me and my colleagues. As I said, this is the start of a wider dialogue that will be facilitated through the Carnegie Council's Ethics Accelerator program, specifically looking at how AI-enabled technologies can be designed and deployed ethically in practice. And all the members of this panel are engaged in different areas of aspect of this research. So please do connect with us to continue this conversation as we try to ensure that AI is deployed and developed in more responsible ways. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists for their incisive remarks.